No civilization ever placed its gods in a valley. Look across every mythology that has survived into the present, and you will find the same instinct expressed again and again in cultures with no possible contact with one another. The sacred belongs above. The Greeks placed their 12 Olympians on the summit of Mount Olympus, wrapped in clouds that mortals could not pass through. Moses climbed Mount Sinai alone to receive the law directly from a god who descended in fire and smoke to meet him at the top, not the bottom. Hindu cosmology places Mount Meru at the literal center of the universe, a golden peak so vast that the sun and moon orbit around it. In Japan, Mount Fuji has been worshipped as a sacred, living presence for over 1,000 years. Its perfect symmetrical cone, considered too holy for ordinary human feet until relatively recently in its long religious history. In Tibet, Mount Kailash is so sacred to 4 separate religions simultaneously: Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and the indigenous Bon tradition that no one has ever been permitted to climb to its summit out of reverence rather than physical difficulty. And when civilizations did not have a mountain available in their landscape, they built one. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt and Mesoamerica, the stepped temple mountains of Java and Cambodia. Every one of these structures exists because a civilization looked at the flat land it actually inhabited and concluded that its gods required elevation that nature had not provided, and so decided to build the mountain itself, stone by stone, with human hands. Why? What is it about height, specifically, that every human civilization associated with divinity, and why did some of them go to such extraordinary lengths to manufacture it artificially when the real thing wasn't available? Begin in Greece, where the sacred mountain becomes not merely a symbol, but a literal physical address. Mount Olympus, at 2,917 meters, the tallest peak in Greece, was understood by the ancient Greeks to be the actual residence of the 12 major gods, not a metaphorical or spiritual location, but a specific geographic place, visible from great distances across the Greek mainland. Its peak, wrapped in cloud for much of the year in a way that gave it genuine, observable mystery. Homer describes it as unshaken by wind, never wet with rain, never covered by snow, where the blessed gods are happy all their days, a place explicitly set apart from the weather and hardship that governed mortal life below. The philosophical logic here is direct and almost architectural. Olympus functions as a vertical hierarchy made visible in landscape. Zeus rules from the summit. Beneath him, arranged on lower slopes and surrounding peaks in various traditions, are the other Olympians. Beneath the entire mountain lies the ordinary world of human beings, farmers and soldiers and sailors, who can see the mountain from their fields but can never climb high enough to reach its true peak, which remains perpetually obscured by cloud. This is a cosmology where social and cosmic hierarchy are the same structure, viewed from different angles. To be closer to Zeus was quite literally to be higher up. And this altitude-based hierarchy extended into Greek religious practice. Many of the most important Greek sanctuaries, including Delphi and the sanctuary of Zeus at Dodona, were deliberately situated on elevated ground, requiring pilgrims to physically climb toward the divine as part of the religious experience itself, so that the geography of worship became an enactment of the theology of worship. The Hebrew tradition treats the mountain differently, not as a permanent residence, but as a specific, temporary meeting point, which makes the theology considerably more dynamic. Mount Sinai appears in Exodus as the site where God descends to meet Moses, and the text is unusually precise about the physical sensory experience: thunder, lightning, a thick cloud, the sound of a trumpet blast growing louder, the whole mountain trembling violently, smoke rising like a furnace because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The people are explicitly forbidden to climb the mountain themselves or even to touch its base, on pain of death, a boundary that is reinforced repeatedly in the text, suggesting the mountain's sanctity was not a passive quality, but an active, dangerous force requiring careful management. Moses alone ascends, spends 40 days on the summit, and descends carrying the tablets of the law, his face so radiant from the encounter that he must wear a veil afterward when speaking to the people. What is theologically distinctive here, compared to Olympus, is that Sinai is not where God lives. God is understood, in Hebrew theology, to be present everywhere, unconfined by any single location. Sinai is where God chose to descend for the specific purpose of establishing a covenant, and once that covenant is established, the mountain's special status recedes. Biblical tradition does not treat Sinai as an ongoing site of pilgrimage or residence, and its precise location is, remarkably, not preserved with certainty in later Jewish tradition. This reflects a fundamental theological difference, where the Greek mountain is a place where a deity permanently lives, closer to a house. The Hebrew mountain is a place where a deity acts, closer to a stage. Height, in this framework, does not indicate that the sacred is physically located in the sky. It indicates separation, elevation above the ordinary, the necessary distance required for something overwhelming to be encountered without immediately destroying the people who encounter it. In Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, the sacred mountain expands from a specific geographic peak into something closer to the structural axis of the entire universe. Mount Meru, described across Puranic and Buddhist cosmological texts, is not merely tall, it is cosmologically central, a golden mountain of truly vast scale situated at the literal center of the universe, around which all other land masses, oceans, and celestial bodies are arranged in concentric rings. The sun and moon are described as orbiting Meru rather than the earth, and the various heavens, including the realm of the god Indra, are located on its successively higher terraces, with the summit itself understood as the point of contact between the manifest, physical universe and the higher, less material planes of existence. This is a considerably more ambitious cosmological claim than either Olympus or Sinai make. Meru is not simply where gods live or where they meet mortals, but the literal structural center that holds the entire arrangement of reality in place, the axis around which everything else, geography, celestial mechanics, the hierarchy of heavens, is organized. And this cosmology had direct architectural consequences across an enormous swath of Asia. Temples throughout the Hindu and Buddhist world, most spectacularly the temple complex at Angkor Wat in Cambodia and the Temple Mountain at Borobudur in Java, were deliberately designed as physical representations of Meru, with rising terraced levels that pilgrims would ascend, moving symbolically from the ordinary physical world at the base toward the higher planes of existence, represented by each successive terrace, culminating in a summit sanctuary that functioned as a physical, walkable model of the cosmic mountain itself. The pilgrim did not simply worship the mountain from a distance, as at Olympus, or climb it once at a decisive historical moment, as Moses did at Sinai. The pilgrim built a small version of the cosmic mountain everywhere they settled, and then climbed it repeatedly, as an ongoing devotional practice, turning the once-in-a-lifetime cosmic geography of Meru into a repeatable, local, physical ritual available to ordinary devotees who would never travel anywhere near the mountain's mythical location. In Japan, Mount Fuji represents a further variation, a sacred mountain whose holiness derives not from housing specific deities in the Greek manner, nor from hosting a specific historical revelation in the Hebrew manner, but from the mountain's own intrinsic living presence. Understood within the Shinto framework of kami, the countless sacred spirits or presences believed to inhabit significant natural features, mountains, rivers, ancient trees, and unusual rock formations. Fuji is worshipped not because a god lives on top of it or once appeared there, but because the mountain itself, as a physical entity, is understood to possess a kind of sacred agency, embodied most directly in the deity Konohanasakuya Hime, the goddess of Mount Fuji and of cherry blossoms, whose shrine sits at the mountain's base. The volcanic nature of Fuji made this living presence theology particularly vivid, a mountain capable of erupting, of visibly and violently demonstrating its own power, was self-evidently not an inert pile of rock, but an active being whose temperament required careful religious attention and appeasement. For much of Japanese religious history, Fuji was considered too sacred for ordinary people, and especially for women, to climb. The practice of Shugendo, a syncretic tradition blending mountain asceticism with Buddhist and Shinto elements, developed specifically around the spiritual discipline of ascending sacred peaks like Fuji as a form of purification and transformation, in which the physical difficulty of the climb was understood as inseparable from the spiritual difficulty of the transformation it produced. The mountain was not simply a location where transformation happened to occur. The climbing itself was the mechanism of transformation, the physical ordeal mapped directly onto spiritual accomplishment. In Tibet, Mount Kailash pushes the logic of the sacred, unclimbed mountain to its most extreme and most philosophically interesting conclusion. A peak so holy across 4 entirely distinct religious traditions that its sanctity is defined specifically by the fact that no one climbs it. Hindus regard Kailash as the abode of Shiva and his consort Parvati, the place of Shiva's eternal meditation. Tibetan Buddhists regard it as the home of the tantric deity Demchok, a manifestation of supreme bliss, and associate it with Mount Meru itself, treating Kailash as the earthly location that corresponds to the cosmic mountain described in Buddhist cosmology. Jains regard it as the site where their first Tirthankara achieved liberation. The indigenous Bon tradition of Tibet considers it the seat of the sky goddess Sepaiman and the central axis of the Bon spiritual universe, entirely independently of the other 3 traditions that later arrived in the region. What unites all 4 traditions, despite their otherwise significant theological differences, is the conviction that the mountain's summit must never be touched by human feet, that Kailash's sacred power depends specifically on remaining unclimbed, in direct contrast to Fuji's tradition of purificatory ascent or Meru's architectural replication as something to be climbed repeatedly. Instead, all 4 traditions developed the practice of parikrama or kora, a ritual circumambulation of the mountain's base, a 52-kilometer walk around Kailash rather than up it, understood as spiritually potent enough that a single circuit is traditionally believed to erase the sins of one lifetime, with the most devoted pilgrims performing the circuit through full-body prostration, measuring the entire distance with their own bodies pressed flat to the ground. Kailash demonstrates that the human relationship to sacred height is not simply higher equals holier, therefore climb higher. Sometimes the specific religious logic inverts entirely. The summit's sanctity is preserved precisely through the discipline of never approaching it, and devotion is expressed through circling the base with total physical submission rather than through ascent. And when a civilization's actual landscape offered no mountain at all, the response across multiple independent traditions was remarkably consistent. Build one. The ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia, rising from the flat alluvial plains of the Tigris and Euphrates where no natural elevation existed for hundreds of miles in any direction, were massive stepped platforms of mud brick, each level smaller than the one below, culminating in a small temple or shrine at the summit understood as the residence of the city's patron deity. The Great Ziggurat of built around 2100 BCE under King Namu, rose in 3 or more terraced levels, connected by monumental staircases, and its name in Sumerian, Edamananki-style structures generally, translates roughly to House of the Mountain or Foundation Platform of Heaven and Earth, an explicit acknowledgement that the structure existed specifically to compensate for a natural mountain the landscape had failed to provide. This is architecture as theological necessity, a civilization that needed elevated sacred ground, and, lacking any, engineered an artificial one with sufficient labor, brick, and bitumen to serve the same religious function a real mountain served elsewhere. The pyramids of Egypt operated on a related but distinct logic, connected less to a residence for living gods and more directly to solar theology and royal ascension. The pyramid shape has been persuasively linked by many Egyptologists to the Benben, the primordial mound that rose from the waters of chaos at the moment of creation in Heliopolitan cosmology, and to the visual image of sunlight itself streaming down in a triangular shaft through clouds toward the earth. The pyramid was simultaneously an artificial mountain, a frozen ray of sunlight, and a mechanism, specifically encoded in the pyramid texts, for the dead pharaoh's soul to ascend toward the sky and join the sun god Ra in his eternal circuit, and in Mesoamerica, entirely independently of both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions, the Maya, Aztec, and earlier Olmec civilizations built stepped pyramids as functioning temple mountains, with the summit shrine serving as the literal point of contact between the human community below and the gods above, staircases oriented for precise astronomical alignment with solstices and equinoxes, transforming the artificial mountain into a working solar instrument as well as a place of worship. In the Andes, entirely isolated from every other tradition in this survey by 2 oceans and thousands of years of separate development, mountain worship reached a level of sustained, documented devotion that rivals anything in Asia. The Inca and the civilizations that preceded them across the Andean highlands worshipped Apis mountain spirits, understood to be powerful, personal deities capable of controlling weather, protecting or endangering local communities, and demanding regular ritual attention through offerings of coca leaves, chicha beer, and llama fat burned on portable altars still constructed by Andean communities today. The most powerful Apis, including the volcanic peaks that dominate the Andean skyline, received the most extreme form of Inca religious devotion, capacocha, a ritual practice in which carefully selected children, chosen for their beauty and purity, were led on a final pilgrimage to the summits of the highest sacred mountains, given maize, beer, and coca to induce a state of calm, and left there to die of exposure in elaborate ceremonial dress, their bodies frozen and extraordinarily well preserved by the permanent ice and cold of the high altitude for centuries afterward. The frozen mummies recovered from sites including Mount Ampato and Lula Laco, discovered by mountaineering archaeologists in the 20th century, remain among the best preserved human remains anywhere in the world, their internal organs, clothing, and even facial expressions intact after 500 years, offering an unusually direct, almost unbearably intimate window into the logic of Andean sacred geography. The summit was not simply symbolically close to the gods. It was understood as the literal threshold where a human life could be most effectively transferred into their permanent care, the coldest and highest point available functioning as the most direct possible channel of communication with the powers that governed weather, harvest, and the continued survival of the empire below. So why does height recur with such insistence across every one of these unconnected traditions? Mircea Eliade's concept of the axis mundi, the same framework that illuminates the world tree traditions, applies here with equal force. The sacred mountain, whether natural or manufactured, functions as a fixed point that organizes the layers of reality, a place where the boundary between heaven, earth, and sometimes the underworld becomes thin enough to cross. But height carries an additional, more immediate psychological logic that trees do not fully capture. To stand at the base of a genuinely tall mountain and look up is to experience, directly and physically, your own smallness in a way few other natural encounters replicate so completely. The summit disappears into cloud, into weather systems that operate independently of anything happening on the ground below, into a zone that is visibly, undeniably beyond ordinary human reach. Mountains are also, observably, where weather originates, where clouds form, where storms gather, where the visible sky seems to actually touch the physical earth. For a species without meteorological science, watching lightning strike a peak, watching clouds pour down a mountainside, watching snow persist on a summit through seasons when the valleys below are green, would have offered constant, visible evidence that mountaintops belong to a different physical regime than everywhere else humans actually lived. The mountain did not need to be explained as sacred. It simply looked and behaved like the boundary of ordinary reality, There is also a bodily dimension to this recognition that no amount of theology can fully substitute for, and every tradition surveyed here understood it instinctively even where their texts do not say so directly. Climbing a mountain is physically difficult in a way that is qualitatively different from ordinary walking. The air itself thins and becomes harder to draw into the lungs. The body labors, the heart pounds, thought slows, and at sufficient altitude, the mind itself begins to behave strangely. A state modern physiology explains through oxygen deprivation, but that every pre-modern climbing tradition interpreted as evidence of approaching a genuinely different order of existence. Moses fasted for 40 days on Sinai's summit. Shugendo ascetics climbing Fuji treated exhaustion as spiritually productive rather than merely unpleasant. Andean pilgrims still describe the final approach to a sacred peak as a state in which ordinary awareness gives way to something else. The mountain, in other words, does not simply symbolize transcendence from a comfortable distance. Climbing one actually produces, in the body of the climber, a series of genuine physiological changes that closely resemble altered states of consciousness independently associated with religious experience across cultures that never compared notes. Every civilization that built a pyramid, climbed a peak, or circled a summit in prostration was working with the same raw material, a body that responds to elevation, exertion, and thinning air by entering a state the mind readily interprets as contact with something larger than itself. The theology varies enormously. The mountain, and what the body does on it, does not.